Imagine this. It is 3 in the morning somewhere over the Arctic Circle. The temperature outside the aircraft is 60 degrees below zero. Inside a B-52 Stratofortress, 8 men sit in near silence, surrounded by dials, gauges, and the low hum of 8 turbofan engines. Beneath their aircraft, secured in the bomb bay, are thermonuclear weapons, each one capable of erasing an entire city from the face of the earth. These men are not on their way to war. They are simply doing their job. They have been in the air for 11 hours already, and they will stay up for another 9. This is not a drill. This is not an exercise. This is Tuesday. This is what the United States Air Force did every single day, for years, without pause, without rest, and without a single moment where the world was not, quite literally, on the edge of annihilation. Welcome to the most extraordinary and terrifying military operation in human history. Welcome to Chrome Dome. Before we go any further, let us be absolutely clear about something. What you are about to hear is not science fiction. It is not a Hollywood thriller. Every single thing in this story actually happened. Real men flew these missions. Real bombs were carried across real skies. Real accidents happened over real towns and real oceans. And behind all of it, behind every flight plan, every alert roster, every sleepless crew member, stood one man. A cigar-chomping, iron-willed, utterly relentless general named Curtis Emerson LeMay. And his motto, the motto he stamped on every base, every aircraft, every corner of Strategic Air Command, was 4 words that dripped with the heaviest kind of irony imaginable. Peace is our profession. Let that sink in for a moment. An organization that existed for the sole purpose of delivering nuclear annihilation to the Soviet Union, an organization that kept loaded nuclear bombers in the air around the clock, called itself a peace organization. That is the world we are entering today. A world where madness masqueraded as strategy, where terror was rebranded as deterrence, and where the fate of all human civilization rested on the shoulders of exhausted airmen flying endless circles in a freezing sky. To understand Chrome Dome, you have to understand the world that created it. And to understand that world, you have to go back further than most people think. You have to go back to the summer of 1945, to a Japan already broken but not yet surrendered, to a young general who had already decided that half measures were the enemy of victory. Curtis LeMay had earned his reputation the hard way. He had flown combat missions himself over Europe, which was almost unheard of for an officer of his rank. He had redesigned bombing formations to make them more effective, even when it meant flying straighter and lower and absorbing more enemy fire. He had watched men die under his command and had concluded that the only way to honor those deaths was to end the war as quickly and as completely as possible, regardless of the cost. When he was transferred to the Pacific Theater and given command of the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan, he did something that shocked even his own subordinates. He stripped the defensive guns from his bombers to increase their payload capacity, flew them at low altitude at night, and dropped incendiary bombs on Japanese cities. The firestorms that resulted killed more people than the atomic bombs that would follow. LeMay himself later said, with a coldness that still chills the blood, that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He knew exactly what he had done. He simply believed it was necessary. This is the man who would go on to build Strategic Air Command into the most powerful military organization the world had ever seen. And when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted, LeMay understood immediately what it meant. The age of American nuclear monopoly was over. The question was no longer whether the United States had a bomb. The question was whether the United States could deliver that bomb faster, more reliably, and more devastatingly than the Soviets could deliver theirs. That question would consume Curtis LeMay for the next 15 years. And his answer would be Chrome Dome. But let us back up even further because Chrome Dome did not appear overnight. It was the product of years of strategic thinking, years of technological development, and years of a particular kind of institutional fear that infected the entire American military establishment throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The fear was simple. What if the Soviets attacked first? What if, on some ordinary morning, Soviet bombers crossed the Arctic and destroyed American air bases before a single American plane could get off the ground? What if the United States, for all its nuclear weapons, found itself unable to respond because its delivery systems had been destroyed in the opening minutes of a surprise attack? This was the nightmare that haunted American military planners. It was called the problem of vulnerability. And Curtis LeMay attacked it the same way he attacked everything, with total commitment, with institutional ferocity, and with a complete willingness to push both men and machines far beyond what anyone had previously thought possible. The first step was to get the bombers off the ground faster. LeMay introduced something called ground alert, where fully armed and fueled bombers sat on runways with crews nearby, ready to launch within minutes of a warning. But even ground alert had a fatal flaw. If the Soviets launched a massive first strike, the warning time might be only minutes. In those minutes, before American bombers could get airborne, Soviet warheads might already be falling on American air bases. The bombers on the ground could be destroyed before they ever got into the air. LeMay needed a solution that made his bombers completely invulnerable to a Soviet first strike. And the solution he arrived at was, in its own way, brilliantly simple. If the bombers were already in the air, they could not be destroyed on the ground. This was the genesis of Airborne Alert. The concept was straightforward. Instead of keeping bombers on the ground ready to launch, you kept them in the air, continuously, around the clock, every day of every week of every year. If the Soviets launched a surprise attack and destroyed every American air base in the opening moments of a war, it would not matter. The bombers were already airborne. They were already armed. They were already pointed at their targets. The Soviet Union could not destroy what it could not catch. And what it could not catch, it could not prevent from destroying Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and every other major Soviet city in a devastating retaliatory strike. This was deterrence in its purest, most terrifying form. You could not start a war because you could not win a war. And you could not win a war because your enemy's weapons were already in the air before your first missile ever left its silo. The program that would eventually become Chrome Dome began in the late 1950s under the name Operation Head Start, then evolved through several iterations before settling into what Strategic Air Command called the Airborne Alert Indoctrination Program. The name Chrome Dome itself referred to the specific flight routes, giant oval-shaped paths that looped from American air bases up over Greenland, across the Arctic, and back down again, keeping the bombers within striking distance of the Soviet Union at all times. The routes were carefully designed to keep the aircraft in international airspace, to ensure they could reach their targets within a set number of hours from any point on the route, and to allow for aerial refueling, because without refueling, even the massive B-52 could not stay in the air indefinitely. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable and underappreciated technologies of the Cold War, aerial refueling. Without it, Chrome Dome was simply impossible. A B-52 Stratofortress, fully loaded with fuel and weapons, had a combat range of roughly 8,000 miles. Impressive by any standard, but not enough to maintain continuous airborne alert on routes that could keep bombers near the Soviet periphery for 10, 12, or 15 hours at a time. The solution was the KC-135 Stratotanker, a flying gas station that could rendezvous with bombers at altitude and transfer tens of thousands of pounds of jet fuel through a rigid boom connected to a receptacle on the receiving aircraft. The precision required for aerial refueling, especially in the psychological pressure was immense. These men lived with the knowledge that, at any moment, they might receive an encoded message ordering them to proceed to their targets and release their weapons. They trained for this. They drilled for this. They knew the procedures by heart. Two-man authentication rules meant that no single person could arm or release a nuclear weapon alone. Both the pilot and another designated crew member had to confirm the order and work together to execute it. But knowing the procedures and living with the reality of what those procedures might require, that was something else entirely. Many veterans of Chrome Dome have spoken about the strange psychological duality of their existence. On the one hand, they were highly trained professionals doing an important job. On the other hand, they were men who might be asked, on any given flight, to participate in the end of the world. Curtis LeMay understood this pressure, and his response to it was characteristically blunt. He demanded perfection. Strategic Air Command under LeMay became famous, some would say infamous, for its culture of rigid standards, constant inspection, and zero tolerance for error. Crews were subjected to no-notice evaluations where inspectors would show up unannounced, pull a crew from their beds, and send them on a simulated combat mission. Every procedure was timed. Every response was graded. Officers who failed to meet standards were relieved of their commands, regardless of their previous record. LeMay believed that the only way to maintain the reliability he needed was to make the consequences of failure so severe that no one would dare be unprepared. Critics called it a culture of fear. LeMay called it professionalism. And in many ways, it worked. Strategic Air Command in the late 1950s and early 1960s was, by any objective measure, the most efficient and disciplined military organization on the planet. Its aircraft were maintained to extraordinary standards. Its crews were among the best trained aviators in the world. Its logistics were impeccable. When SAC said a mission would fly, the mission flew. When SAC said a bomber would be ready, the bomber was ready. LeMay had taken an organization that was, in the late 1940s, a somewhat chaotic and underprepared force, and transformed it into a machine of almost inhuman precision. The irony, of course, was that this machine existed for the purpose of mass murder on an almost incomprehensible scale. LeMay's war plans called for the simultaneous delivery of hundreds of nuclear weapons against Soviet cities and military installations in the opening hours of any conflict. The casualties that would have resulted were measured not in thousands, but in tens of millions. LeMay knew this. His planners knew this. And they proceeded anyway, because they believed, and this is crucial, they genuinely believed that the only thing preventing the Soviet Union from launching its own attack was the absolute certainty that any such attack would result in Soviet annihilation. This was the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, and it was the philosophical backbone of everything that Strategic Air Command did. The logic was circular but internally consistent. We maintain the ability to destroy the Soviet Union because the Soviets want to destroy us. The Soviets do not attack because they know we will destroy them. We do not attack because we know they will destroy us. Therefore, both sides are deterred. Therefore, there is peace. Therefore, peace is our profession. The motto was not cynical. Or at least, it was not only cynical. For LeMay and for many of the men who served under him, it was a genuine expression of what they believed they were doing. They were not war makers. They were war preventers. They were the reason the Cold War stayed cold. But deterrence is only as strong as its credibility, and credibility requires capability, and capability requires demonstration. This is why Chrome Dome was not enough on its own. LeMay also pushed for, and largely won, a massive expansion of SAC's conventional and nuclear capabilities throughout the 1950s. He presided over the introduction of the B-47 Stratojet, the first truly modern swept-wing jet bomber, which replaced the propeller-driven B-29s and B-50s that had been SAC's primary strike aircraft in the late 1940s. He then oversaw the introduction of the even more capable B-52 52, which would become the backbone of Chrome Dome operations and which remains in service, in heavily modified form, to this day. He pushed for the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, recognizing that bombers alone were not sufficient to guarantee a credible second strike capability. He advocated for hardened underground missile silos, for dispersal of forces, for redundancy and survivability in every aspect of the nuclear arsenal. LeMay was, in the truest sense, the architect of American nuclear deterrence. He was also a man who came perilously close, on at least one occasion, to starting the war he was trying to prevent. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, LeMay was the Air Force Chief of Staff, having left his position at SAC. When President Kennedy and his advisors were debating how to respond to the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, LeMay was one of the most aggressive voices in the room. He argued forcefully for immediate airstrikes against the missile sites, dismissing Kennedy's preference for a naval blockade as weak and ineffective. He reportedly told the president, to his face, that the blockade was tantamount to appeasement, a comparison to Munich that Kennedy found infuriating. When Kennedy chose the blockade and the crisis was eventually resolved through negotiation, LeMay's response was astonishing. He called it the greatest defeat in American history. Not a victory, not a peaceful resolution that avoided nuclear war. A defeat. Because in LeMay's worldview, any outcome that did not involve the complete destruction of Soviet military capability in Cuba was a failure of American resolve. This tells you something essential about Curtis LeMay. He was not a warmonger in the simple, cartoonish sense. He did not want war for its own sake. But he had such profound contempt for Soviet communism, such absolute conviction in the rightness of American power, and such complete faith in the logic of military force that he was unable to see diplomacy as anything other than weakness. He genuinely believed that the Soviets respected only strength, and that any concession, any compromise, any negotiated settlement was an invitation to further aggression. In this, he was both a product of his time and a man whose views placed him at odds with an increasingly large portion of the American political establishment as the 1960s wore on. Meanwhile, Chrome Dome continued. And as it continued, the inherent tensions of the program began to manifest in ways that the public would only learn about much later. Because keeping nuclear bombers in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, meant that accidents were not just possible. They were, from a statistical standpoint, essentially inevitable. And accidents involving nuclear weapons were, to put it mildly, not something the United States government was eager to publicize. The first major incident came in 1961, just as Chrome Dome was hitting its full operational stride. AB-52 carrying two Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke apart in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. The aircraft experienced a structural failure, the crew ejected, and the two bombs fell toward the ground. One of the bombs behaved almost exactly as it would have in a normal combat drop. Its parachute deployed, its arming mechanisms activated. Later analysis would reveal that 3 of the 4 safety switches on that bomb had failed. A single switch, 1 out of 4, was all that stood between a North Carolina tobacco field and a nuclear explosion roughly 260 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The other bomb hit the ground at high speed, broke apart, and its components were scattered and partially buried. The Air Force spent years trying to recover all the pieces. Some of them are still in the ground in North Carolina today. Let that fact breathe for a moment. Right now, as you listen to this, pieces of a 1961 American nuclear bomb are buried in a farm field in North Carolina, not in the Soviet Union. Not in some distant Cold War theater. In North Carolina, the Goldsboro incident was classified for decades. The American public was told that the bombs had not been armed and that there had been no danger. This was, to put it politely, not entirely true. When documents were declassified decades later, they revealed just how close the United States had come to accidentally detonating a nuclear weapon on its own soil. The damage, thermal, blast, and radiation, would have been catastrophic. And this was not the only incident of its kind. In 1966, a B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission collided with its KC-135 tanker during aerial refueling over Palomares, Spain. Both aircraft were destroyed. The B-52 was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs. 3 of the bombs were recovered on land, but their conventional explosives had detonated on impact, scattering plutonium over a wide area of Spanish farmland. The United States spent months cleaning up the contaminated soil, removing hundreds of tons of radioactive material, and managing the diplomatic fallout with a Spanish government that was understandably not pleased to find American nuclear weapons scattered across its territory. The 4th bomb fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was not recovered for nearly 3 months, despite a massive search operation that involved dozens of ships and submersible vehicles. And then came Thule. In January 1968, a B-52 on a Chrome Dome mission experienced a cabin fire that forced the crew to abandon the aircraft. The bomber crashed onto the sea ice of North Star Bay near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The conventional explosives in all 4 nuclear weapons detonated on impact, and the resulting fire spread radioactive contamination across a wide area of ice and, eventually, into the ocean. The United States and Denmark, which administered Greenland, launched an enormous cleanup operation called Project Crested Ice. Workers in protective suits collected tens of thousands of pieces of radioactive debris from the ice. The cleanup took months and involved thousands of workers, many of whom later developed health problems they attributed to radiation exposure. But here is the detail that did not emerge until decades later. The United States Air Force had, at some point, lost count of one of the bombs. They knew 4 bombs had been on the aircraft. They recovered what they believed to be components of 4 bombs. But subsequent analysis suggested that one complete bomb secondary, the thermonuclear component, might never have been recovered. It might still be somewhere on the floor of Baffin Bay, an American hydrogen bomb, on the ocean floor, under the Arctic, possibly still there. The Thule accident had enormous consequences for Chrome Dome. Denmark, whose territory had been contaminated by an American nuclear accident that the Danish government had not even known was happening, because Denmark officially prohibited nuclear weapons in its territory, and the American government had simply not told them about Chrome Dome flights over Greenland, was understandably furious. The diplomatic pressure that followed, combined with the obvious safety risks that the accidents had demonstrated, led the United States to significantly curtail Chrome Dome operations. By the end of 1968, the continuous airborne alert that had been a feature of American nuclear strategy for nearly a decade was effectively over. But the end of Chrome Dome did not mean the end of the strategic logic that had created it. The deterrence mission simply shifted to other platforms, to submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which were even more survivable than airborne bombers because a submerged submarine was essentially impossible to find and destroy, and to hardened intercontinental ballistic missiles in underground silos. The triad of bombers, missiles, and submarines that would define American nuclear strategy for the remainder of the Cold War was already taking shape even as Chrome Dome was winding down. LeMay's great insight, that deterrence required survivability, and survivability required dispersal, and dispersal required redundancy, had been institutionalized so thoroughly that even the end of the specific program he championed did not diminish the strategic architecture he had built. Curtis LeMay left the Air Force in 1965, frustrated with the direction of American military policy under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who had introduced a new approach called flexible response that LeMay found baffling and dangerous. McNamara believed that the United States needed a full spectrum of military options, from conventional forces through theater nuclear weapons to strategic nuclear weapons, so that it could respond proportionally to any level of Soviet aggression without immediately escalating to all-out nuclear war. LeMay thought this was absurd. In his view, the whole point of nuclear weapons was that they made any conflict with the Soviet Union potentially unlimited. Trying to limit a nuclear war was like trying to be slightly pregnant. Either you were going to war or you were not. Either you were going to use your weapons or you were not. The idea of calibrated nuclear response struck him as precisely the kind of half measure that had gotten America into trouble before. After his retirement, LeMay's public profile took an unexpected and deeply damaging turn. In 1968, he agreed to serve as the vice presidential running mate of George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who was running for president on an independent ticket. For LeMay, the appeal of the Wallace campaign was primarily military. Wallace was a hawk on Vietnam, and LeMay had been deeply critical of the Johnson administration's conduct of the war, which he believed was being fought with the same fatal timidity that he had always despised. He wanted, famously, to bomb North Vietnam back to the Stone Age, a phrase he used in a 1965 book and which followed him for the rest of his life. But the association with Wallace, a man whose campaign was inextricably linked to racial segregation and opposition to the civil rights movement, permanently tarnished LeMay's reputation and ensured that his legacy would always be complicated. He died in 1990, at the age of 83, having lived long enough to see the Cold War essentially won, to see the Berlin Wall fall, and to see the Soviet Union begin its final collapse. Whatever you think of Curtis LeMay, and there is genuinely a great deal to think and to argue about, it is very difficult to deny that the world he helped build was one in which the catastrophic conflict that he spent his career preparing for never actually happened. Whether this was because of deterrence or despite it, whether Chrome Dome made the world safer or more dangerous, whether LeMay's particular brand of strategic thinking was brilliant or reckless, or some inextricable combination of both. These are questions that historians still argue about today. But let us go back to that B-52 over the Arctic one more time. Because what happened inside that aircraft, what happened to the men who flew those missions, deserves more attention than it usually gets. Think about what it meant to be a Chrome Dome crew member in 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You are in the air. You have been in the air for 15 hours. You are somewhere over the Arctic, flying your oval route, and below you and around you the world is on the edge of nuclear war in a way that it has never been before and, please God, has never been since. The messages coming over your radio are coded and routine, but you know, because you are a smart person who reads newspapers and listens to the radio when you are on the ground, that the President of the United States and the Premier of the Soviet Union are engaged in a standoff that could end civilization. You know that the weapons in your bomb bay are real. You know that the targets in your NAV bag are real. You know that if a certain message comes over a certain frequency and you authenticate it correctly, you and your crew will turn this aircraft toward the Soviet Union and you will not come home. And you continue flying. Because that is your job. Because you are a professional. Because peace, as the sign at the gate of your base reminds you every time you drive through it, is your profession. There is a particular kind of courage required to do this work, not the hot, adrenaline-fueled courage of direct combat, but something colder and stranger and in some ways more demanding. The courage to sit with the weight of what you carry day after day, year after year, and to never flinch, and to never let the weight crush you, and to keep flying. The men of Strategic Air Command who flew Chrome Dome missions are, by and large, not famous. They are not the subjects of blockbuster films or best-selling memoirs. Many of them went to their graves without ever telling their families exactly what they had done or what they had been prepared to do. They carried a secret that was too large and too dark to share easily. They had been, for years, the last line between human civilization and its destruction. And then the Cold War ended, and the world moved on, and most people forgot that they had ever existed. They deserved to be remembered, not uncritically. The program they served was genuinely dangerous, genuinely flawed, and came genuinely close to disaster on multiple occasions. Not without acknowledging the terrible logic that had created it and the terrible weapons they had carried, but remembered and understood and appreciated for what they did and what they were willing to do. Strategic Air Command officially merged into other commands in 1992 as the Cold War ended and the American military restructured for a new world. The motto, "Peace is our profession," went with it into the history books. The B-52 remained in service, doing work that LeMay would have recognized even if the context had changed entirely. Chrome Dome itself became a footnote, known primarily to historians and to the shrinking population of veterans who had been part of it. But the questions it raises do not fade with the institutional history. Questions about deterrence. Does the threat of mutual destruction actually prevent war, or does it simply raise the stakes of any miscalculation to an unsurvivable level? Questions about accountability. Who is responsible when a military machine designed for mass destruction has an accident and contaminates a Spanish farm field or a Greenland fjord? Questions about the human cost. What does it do to a person to spend years of their life prepared, on a moment's notice, to participate in the end of the world? Questions about the gap between stated intentions and actual effects. Can a program designed to prevent war actually make war more likely by making the weapons of war more numerous, more accessible, and more routinely deployed? These are not merely historical questions. They are questions that remain urgently relevant in a world that still has thousands of nuclear weapons, that still operates on something like the logic of mutual assured destruction, that still has to grapple with the possibility of accidents, miscalculations, and the catastrophic consequences of institutional failure. The specific form of Chrome Dome is gone. The strategic imperative that created it is not. Curtis LeMay built something unprecedented, a machine of deterrence so powerful and so persistent that it helped define the entire Cold War era. He did it through force of will, through institutional genius, through a willingness to push men and machines to their absolute limits, and through a clarity of strategic vision that his admirers found inspiring and his critics found terrifying. He kept the bombers in the air. He kept the weapons ready. He kept the peace, or helped keep it, for the entirety of his tenure, in the specific sense that the war he was preparing for never came. Whether that was worth the cost, the accidents, the contamination, the psychological burden on thousands of airmen, the constant flirtation with catastrophe, the institutionalization of a readiness for mass murder as a permanent feature of American national life. That is a judgment that each of us has to make for ourselves. History rarely gives us clean answers to its biggest questions. The history of Chrome Dome is no exception. What it gives us instead is a story of extraordinary men doing an extraordinary and terrible thing in what they believed was the service of peace. A story of a general who understood war so thoroughly that he became, in some essential way, a part of it, who could not separate the logic of destruction from the goal of preservation, who could not imagine safety without the constant readiness to kill on an unimaginable scale. A story of a world that built the tools of its own annihilation and then, with a combination of skill, luck, and perhaps divine mercy, managed not to use them. The B-52s are still flying. The nuclear weapons are still there. The world is still living with the legacy of what Curtis LeMay built. And somewhere, in archives and in the fading memories of old airmen, the full story of Chrome Dome is still waiting to be completely told. That story matters. It matters because it is true. It matters because it is ours. And it matters because the choices that were made in those years, The choices about how to manage the most dangerous weapons ever invented, about how to balance security against risk, about how much terror is acceptable in the name of peace. Those choices echo forward into the present day in ways that we are still, as a civilization, working to understand. Peace is our profession. For words, a motto carved in stone at the gates of air bases across America during the long years of the Cold War. For words that contained within them a paradox so vast and so dark that it took a generation of the smartest and most dedicated military minds in American history to live inside it, and none of them ever fully resolved it. Now the question falls to us.